Hi, everybody. This is Gabriella Grasso. I'm a journalist, and with Q-Code Mag, which is a web magazine that has been online for 8 years now and covers stories from all over the world, and also has a print edition now that comes out every 6 months. We are very happy to introduce a series of interviews with writers from various countries. The idea with Q-Code Mag is that of opening up to different points of view, building bridges between cultures. And that is the reason why we decided to do the interviews in English. So there's many people as possible could follow, and also we could chat directly with the authors. Today, I have the pleasure to have with me, connected from Sweden, Elisabeth Asbrink, who is a journalist and a writer. And her latest book, which is entitled Made in Sweden, I'll show it to you, is published in Italy by Iperborea with a translation by Alessandro Borini. It is a collection of short essays, but which are very enjoyable. You really read them as short novels, short stories, sorry. Each of these short essays or stories, they deal with a different aspect of Swedish culture and history. And each one of them can be read independently from the others. But while you read, whichever way you choose to read them, little by little, you find yourself diving into the heart of Swedishness, which is really interesting. And first of all, Elisabeth, I would ask you to tell us the title in Swedish, because I wouldn't dare to try my pronunciation. So that's, when I'll give you, the word, maybe you could, tell us that. And the first thing I would like to ask you is that the book starts and ends with the issue of identity. The very first chapter, very first chapter, you take us back to 98 after Christ, the first moment when the people who were at the time inhabitants of the country we now call Sweden, started to be named and named themselves. That's the very beginning. And then you finish nowadays quoting the words of a rapper who is half Swedish, well, Swedish from Gambian origins, which I guess, it's a way of questioning who is the real Swedish person today, who are Swedish. And I understand, because you write about it, that's something you've been questioning yourself about personally, because you were born and raised in Sweden from a British mom and Hungarian father. So let's start about, with this, with your personal questioning about your identity and questioning Swedish identity.
Well, there's so many ways to start that conversation. Identity is always two things. It's always first what you yourself think is your identity, but it's also what the surrounding world thinks is your identity. And these aren't always connected. Sometimes they are different things, and there's a conflict then appears. And for me, as I was born to immigrant parents, I was made literally in Sweden and born in Sweden. But
by the way, what's the title? What's the title in?
Oh, sorry. Yes, the title in Swedish is The Words That Created Sweden. Orden som formade Sverige.
Okay.
So, because I wanted to emphasize language in the title, because this is a book also about how language creates connections, but also creates differences. And it's also a way of talking about how language can be used as a power instrument. But it's also a lot of, I use songs use religious hymns. I use things that we say, people who live in this country, we say certain things. Like people in your country, you say certain things and you know what that means. But and this is also what keeps us together. It's a bit like, you know, like Natalia Ginsburg's family lexicon. It's the same idea. So language is an important stuff in identity, always. But, you know, I grew up with two immigrant parents, and they felt estranged by Swedish culture. For instance, I write about the thing about shoes in Sweden. My mother is born in London, my father in Budapest. And when they came to Sweden, they were invited to friends, Swedish friends, for dinner, and they dressed up, they bought a bottle of wine and all that. But when they came to the friend's house, they had to take their shoes off, because in Sweden, you do not walk into a room, someone else's home, with shoes on. That's very rude. So little things, but still they made my parents feel like strangers. And they just transmitted this sense of strangeness to me. So I grew up feeling not Swedish, but I wasn't Hungarian, I wasn't English, I was nothing. And then I became 22 and went to Egypt and met some young people there. And they asked me, in Sweden, do you marry because of love or because of money? Which is a brilliant question. And I said, love, of course we marry out of love. But then I realized the reason I could marry out of love was, and then I started talking about the Swedish welfare system, education for girls and boys, the same pay for women and men, childcare so a mother can work, all these things that made it possible for me to say, I want to marry you out of love. So suddenly, after feeling like a stranger in all my life, I realized I was very Swedish. So identity is something moving. It's dynamic. And that goes also for national values. And this is also a reason for me writing this book. When I started writing it, there was a debate going on in Sweden about Swedishness. What is Swedish? What is un-Swedish? And the people who started this debate were the right-wing populists. And they seemed to have no problem in saying, this is Swedish, this is not Swedish. There was a clear line in between. And then there were people protesting against this, and they said, there is nothing like Swedishness. Everything is universal, universal values. So I just thought, everyone's wrong. You know, all of them, they're all wrong. And that's why I wrote the book, because I have a third version of what Swedish values or national values are. That was a long answer.
No, it's okay. But now, you know, you've just said that you found a third way, so you have to tell us what the third way is.
Yes. Well, I mean, having my background and seeing my parents, you know, struggle with Swedish values and Swedish traditions, and sometimes loving Swedish traditions as well. Of course, there is something specific that is Swedish. It comes from historical choices, political choices. It comes from the climate. It comes from several different purposes and reasons. But, and this is where the right-wing populists are completely wrong, values change, which I am very, very grateful for. the values that ruled for 50 years ago are not the same today. And in 50 years, the Swedish values, the specific Swedish values, they will be changed, because this is also moving matter, dynamic matter. So what the right-wing populists do, not only in Sweden, but in all over the world, is that they take a certain piece of the timeline. You know, they start here and they end there, and they say, all of this is the real Italy or the real Sweden. Nothing that came before it is the real Italy or Sweden, and nothing that comes after it is the real Sweden or Italy. Only this. And they are completely wrong. And I mean, we can only look at the situation in politics for women, for instance. For 50 years ago, I wouldn't have wanted to be a woman, a young woman in Sweden. It was different laws, different social regulations, and a different moral, but the values have changed. So I think now one of the best things about Sweden is the possibilities for a young woman to be whatever she wants to be. She can dress like she wants to dress, and all these basic things, educate herself, have a family, not have a family. All these choices are available, and they're just as good as the other.
But I have to say, Elisabeth, reading your book, I was talking about it with a friend, and we were really struck by the fact that you talk about women or even men that had feminist views in the 19th centuries. I mean, and I was really amazed. I mean, Mr. You have to pardon my
Almqvist, yes.
Almqvist. In 1839, he writes things that are so amazingly modern, talking about women and how women and men should relate to one another. And also Friederike Bremer in 1856, she writes a book who is radically feminist. So I have to say that for sure, I mean, more than me, for sure, Sweden has changed in this last 50 years. But I can assure you that what comes out from your book is that there was something undercover, how I would say, that made, women and even men be more advanced before other people in Europe. And I'm not saying the majority, of course. But there was space for people. I mean, Friederike Bremer, you talk about this book she publishes, and it's absolutely, would you like to tell us more about her, maybe?
Yes, well, I mean, I agree with you. Sweden was early in thinking about men and women and sexuality and legal rights, because Sweden at this time had a strong influence of the liberal politics, the liberal ideas coming from the French Revolution and the ideas inspired by it. But Almqvist, this fantastic person, he was completely excluded from society, and he had to escape from Sweden, and he couldn't stay there. He lost his job, he lost everything because of his ideas. So Sweden wasn't prepared for this. Friederike Bremer, she came a bit later than Almqvist, and she had to struggle for the right to become independent as a woman. She didn't want to marry. And so she experienced the injustice between men and women, very hard on herself. And first she writes a lot of Jane Austen-like books and becomes rich. And then she writes this political book when she is rich enough to become independent. And the book, it's all about that women, when they're 25 years old, should be allowed to become independent and not be under the rule of a father or a brother or a husband. So this book started a debate, and after 2 years of debate, she actually changed the law, changed the society, which was a huge victory. But she was rich and she was independent and popular all over the world. It was like, you know, Astrid Lindgren would have done something. So they were specific. And then Sweden turned inwards and became quite conservative and became a country that was quite late in equality. For instance, Denmark was earlier in giving women rights because Sweden closed itself again. So all these things have changed and will change again in a way.
But still, you know, I don't know if you wrote about many women because you're a woman, so you were interested in finding, you know, how many women throughout history have been important for your country, or because actually it is something, you know, that you know, surprises once you start studying the history of your country. But for example, another one that, you know, I didn't know because you know, we don't study so well the history of other countries is Queen Margaret. In the 14th century, she was like amazing. I mean, an amazing woman. So tell us something about her. That was 8 years ago.
Yes, but she was an amazing woman, and someone should do a Netflix series about her because she was. Okay, I'll try to. No, but she was unique, and to just tell it short, she was a daughter of a king, and she got married to a son of another king, and the purpose was to unite the Nordic areas to become one country. But she was so she wasn't actually allowed to become a queen because she was a woman, but she had a son. And when he was supposed to become a king, she became his guardian. So she ruled through her son, who was a child. And through her rulings, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden formed a union, which was very powerful and very interesting. So it was one country under one queen. And that, of course, made Scandinavia a much more powerful opponent to the German dominance in Europe, which was huge, for instance. And then when her son died, she very quickly adopted another son, and he became king, so she could become his guardian. So she's very clever at the political, the policy of power. But she's a strong woman, and what maybe is most impressive with her is that when she's in her last will, she actually decides that because she has started wars and she has won wars, but she decides that a lot of her fortune should go to the women who were raped and mistreated during these wars, and they should also go to the soldiers' families, the soldiers who died, not only on her side, but also on the enemy's side. So deep within, she was a humanist, valuing human lives and also recognizing that women suffer during wartime. So she was very, very special.
Yeah, in the 14th century. I mean, that's really amazing. What I found really great about the book is that it is very honest, because you want to show the lights and the shadows of Swedish culture and history. So on one hand, you mentioned the welfare, you mentioned, you know, the rights for women, we mentioned Mr. Almqvist. Oh, sorry. That you know, yes, he was discriminated in his society, but he had really amazing and enlightened ideas. But on the other hand, you also talk about the sterilizing campaign that went on in the 20s, the discrimination against the Sami population, and also the help given to the Nazi Germans in, during World War II. So, of course, given the fact that there is no people, as there is no person who is all good and all bad. So, but have you found, studying history, have you found clues to explain these contradictions in?
Well, you brought up 3 different examples, and they all have a little different explanations. If we talk about sterilizations, Sweden is the Scandinavian country who sterilized most of its, more of its citizens than any other Scandinavian country. And the Scandinavian countries were all built basically on the same welfare state model, which is depending on the citizens paying a lot of tax and then getting the money back through social security, school, health, education, all of this, and good living standard. But when the state starts to give out money, they only want to give this money to people who deserve it. And this is a problem with this welfare state model. If we have large groups that don't work and don't pay taxes, they are looked upon as parasites of the welfare state. Today, this view is sometimes up on the surface when it comes to immigrants. But in the 30s, they weren't concerned about immigrants being parasites. They were concerned about unmarried women. Because the welfare state had decided that all children should receive what do you say? Well, a sum of money. Yeah, so that children shouldn't suffer if their families were poor. So for each child, there was going out a sum of money. But if you were an unmarried woman and had sexual relations and became pregnant, you had children that no one took responsibility for. And all this was looked upon as a threat to the whole welfare system. This is why Sweden starts to sterilize unmarried women because they are afraid that these women will get too many children and they will get this money. So it's a very interesting model, because later on the same idea has been applied on immigrants. If an immigrant only receives help from the state but doesn't work and pay tax, they are regarded as parasites. But maybe so the way of looking at people as parasites was the foundation of the sterilization campaign. And why was Sweden?
Sorry, what is interesting is that this horrible, fact comes from welfare. So
yes,
we
exactly.
always
exactly, and it's also interesting that it happened. It was worse in Sweden because in the surrounding countries, and also England has a similar welfare system, but it didn't happen in England. It didn't happen as much in Denmark and Norway and Finland, because in those countries, the doctors are independent and private. But Sweden has this tradition of making everything state controlled. So all the doctors in Sweden were actually employed by the state. So when the state decides that these people should be sterilized, the doctors follow it. In England or in Denmark, they would never follow it. They were independent. They didn't have to do what the state wanted. And then also, this could only happen because it was a Protestant country. in Catholic countries, as you might know, the Catholic idea of the world is that anything concerning child and childbirth is something holy. You shouldn't interfere with that. So this did absolutely not happen in Catholic countries. It's the Protestant view of the state, its citizens, and the state's responsibility towards the whole that make you sacrifice individuals like this. So this is an interesting thing, and I have thought a lot about it now during the pandemic, because as you know, Sweden has chosen a completely different route than the rest of the Nordic countries and also the rest of the world. And we have had a lot of dead people, a terrible death rate. And I have found it, I've been wondering if there is a connection in this, the way that people are viewed. Yeah, this, I haven't thought this through yet. I just can see there is a parallel here. Sweden is different in this way somehow.
We are running out of time, but I might.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, but there are so many things. It was really difficult to choose which ones, to ask you about. Maybe the last question, and then you can read us a little bit of the beginning of the book, is at one point you talk about football star Zlatan Ibrahimovic. I'm a great fan, by the way. Yes. And you say that basically he has always been known for being very individualistic, at least in the way he plays, and you say actually Sweden has become as individualistic as he is.
Definitely.
So yes. you suggest that there has been a change since the beginning of the third millennium. So
absolutely a dramatic change.
In a couple of minutes, that's not enough, but
I'll try to make it short. But the history of Zlatan is very interesting, because when he was a new player, he was interviewed, and they always kept saying that he was so proud of himself and individualistic, and they wrote un-Swedish. Mm-hmm. So, and then for a couple of years ago, Volvo, the car, they made a commercial where Zlatan Ibrahimovic is the star. Mm-hmm. And there he walks around and he declares the national anthem. So suddenly he is Sweden. And it's about 25 years between un-Swedish Zlatan and super Swedish Zlatan. And what has changed? Well, Zlatan hasn't changed. He has been the same. But Sweden has gone through an enormous transformation from being a country where a lot of things were state controlled, state operated, and with state responsibility, to a privatization. Houses have become private, hospitals, schools, old people's homes, all of these things, the post, the pharmacies, the taxis, all of the things, the telephone system, the television, all these things were state controlled in a good way, one could say, when I was a child. I mean, they didn't decide what was said on television, but they owned it somehow. Now it's all private. And one can say that, for instance, 1983, the income differences in Sweden were minimal. There was no one really rich and there was no one very poor. Today, this privatization of society, the focus on the individual instead of the collective, has created a huge differences in income. So now suddenly we have very rich people and we have very poor people. So the idea of Sweden as this welfare state paradise is actually old. It's passé. It's not really relevant anymore. And this is what Zlatan is a symbol of. Every Swede is now individualistic and plays for the team if it suits him.
Mhm.
So I conclude that Zlatan was never un-Swedish. He was only Swedish before everyone else was Swedish.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, yes, we have like very few minutes. Would you read just to begin
I'll read.
a few lines?
Yes, I'll read from my English version of Made in Sweden, and I'll read just the beginning. It took 23 years, uncountable questions during my adolescence about my origins, and one visit to Egypt for me to understand that I was in fact Swedish, sort of. Born in Sweden, even made in Sweden, according to my parents, but with a British mother and a Hungarian father, that was not obvious for me or those around me. Where do you come from? I was asked again and again as a girl growing up in Stockholm. And as I usually tell the truth, I answered, I come from Gothenburg, Sweden's second biggest city. Sometimes they accepted this, but sometimes not, because sometimes they asked, yeah, but really? I never knew how they spotted me. My name sounded Swedish enough. I didn't have an accent. Could it have been my hair? I still haven't got a clue. Something foreign transmitted from me, something atypical. It followed me wherever I went, and I cried. All I ever wanted was to look like Agneta from ABBA.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elisabeth. So
Thank
here
you.
again, Made in Sweden, Elisabeth Asbrink.
Right?
Hyperborea. It's whether you are a fan of Sweden or you want to become a fan of Sweden, you should read this book because it really gives you really the desire to know more and to visit the country. So thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Elisabeth,
you.
and thanks everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.